Hello and welcome to our webinar on cybersecurity. My name is Chelsea Grover and I'm the Marketing Manager for DAS Health. Before we get started on today's webinar, I want to take a moment to explain the process for the presentation. First, I'd like to mention this webinar will be recorded and that we'll send out a copy of the slides along with the recording within the next week. Next, I see a number of new folks who've joined us today, so this seems like a great time to do a quick reminder of who DAS Health is. DAS Health is a leading provider of health IT and management solutions and a trusted consultant to many physicians groups, hospitals, and healthcare systems across North America. We offer a full range of business and technology solutions to help you in your practice, including consulting services, RCM, remote patient monitoring, MSP managed IT services, hosting, obviously security and cybersecurity, and compliance, just to name a few. If you'd like more detailed information on any of that, just drop us a note in the questions area and we'd be happy to fill you in. Okay, so back to today's webinar on cybersecurity vulnerability management. At the end of the presentation, we'll open the floor up to questions from you. We'll answer all the questions at the end, but you can type them in the questions area of the webinar control panel whenever they occur to you. And finally, for audio clarity purposes, everyone's phone will remain muted throughout the entire webinar. If you experience audio issues, please use the chat box to let us know so we can resolve them. And again, questions may be asked in the questions box. So, without further delay, I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. Nick DeMeo is one of our cybersecurity specialists, and Heather Benefill is our product manager of cybersecurity at DAS Health, which means that they are both in excellent positions to be discussing this stuff today. And also Mike Spur, Vice President of Cybersecurity, will be loitering in the background to jump in with additional information as needed. So with that, Heather, I'll go ahead and let you get started.
Thanks, Chelsea, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you here today, and I look forward to a great discussion. Today, we will review the importance of vulnerability management, discuss what CVEs are, review the KEV. We will outline how to develop an effective vulnerability management strategy, review vulnerability management lifecycle, discuss closing vulnerability scan gaps and the differences between a vulnerability scan and a vulnerability assessment. For now, I'll hand it over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Heather. Appreciate it. We just wanted to start off with a little bit of a light mood. And we have this nice little comic with a angry ostrich, and he's asking his coworker, have you addressed all of your vulnerabilities yet? And with the head in the sand, he says, I don't see any vulnerabilities. So all jokes aside, vulnerability management, it's a very important and crucial part of your organization's security posture. Due to its complexity, it can often get overlooked or regarded as not needed. But hopefully after today, with all the information we provide, you will walk away with just understanding just how absolutely necessary it is to the future of your business. And Heather, I'd like to turn it back to you real quick to go over some extra bonus for the healthcare industry.
Thanks, Nick. Cybersecurity in healthcare protects electronic information and assets from unauthorized access, use, loss, and disclosure. Its goal is to safeguard the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of confidential information. Here are 4 reasons why the healthcare industry is vulnerable. A complex supply chain. From cleaning supplies, PPE, and scanning machines to climate-controlled transport of drugs, the healthcare system is a highly complex supply chain. This makes security practices hard to incorporate. Data gone digital. Digitized patient data ensures information is always accessible, up-to-date, and easily communicated, but it also makes this data an increasingly attractive target for cybercriminals. Connected and outdated devices. Medical devices are increasingly connected to the internet. Doctors and nurses rely on these machines to monitor patient health and serve as a partner in diagnosis. Each connected device offers another potential entry point for hackers. Overstretched staff. The majority of breaches related to data privacy in healthcare are the result of employee error and unauthorized disclosure. In the already overstretched world of hospitals and practices, it's no wonder that cybersecurity is not the top mind for most workers. The bottom line is that all healthcare organizations are vulnerable to a cybersecurity attack. Some common causes of breaches that we see happening are a result of having outdated technology, that healthcare staff wasn't educated on online risks, unauthorized access through remote access, and simply having a weak cybersecurity posture. Healthcare data is more valuable than your social security number or credit card data. Your healthcare data contains not only the basic personally identifiable information, but your protected health information, which includes your pharmacy, dates and times of your doctor visits, your insurance information, and all of your medical history. Criminals publish the stolen data on the dark web and make a ton of money, which is why they target small to medium-sized practices. They're hoping to find a way in and get a paycheck. If they can get into your system, and let's just say you have about 1,000 patients' data, I'd assume a lot more, but at 1,000 patients, the hacker made $250,000 in a day's worth of work. So this leads us to vulnerability management. Vulnerability management is the process in which vulnerabilities in the IT system are identified and the risks of those vulnerabilities are evaluated. The evaluation leads to a correction, removal, or acceptance of risk by the organization. Vulnerability management is a continuous, proactive, and often automated process that keeps your computer systems, networks, and enterprise applications safe from cyber attacks and data breaches. As such, it is an important part of an overall security program. Specific objectives of vulnerability management are again to identify software faults that affect security, conduct asset management, mitigating any new security threats that have been identified, effective management of security risks, and compliance with audits and regulations. I think this is a good point to hand it over to you, Nick. Can you tell us about CVEs?
Nick, I think you might be muted.
Thanks, Heather. Doing a great job of highlighting those key objectives. Before we get into the vulnerability management solution, we really wanted to give you all some bonus information. And I wanted to start off by going over CVEs. And these are common vulnerabilities and exposures. And what this is actually a program that's funded by the US government, and it gives organizations insight with real time on current vulnerabilities found. This can give an outsider's view on software or devices that may be susceptible to an attack. Now, there's thousands and thousands of CVEs right now, and it is important to know not all are actively being exploited. They could be found through research or third-party vendor testing. But we have to ask ourselves, well, how do we know which ones are being exploited? So that brings us to a very valuable resource that us security professionals absolutely adore. And that is another catalog, which is, again, operated by the federal government. And this is called KEV. And this is Known Exploited Vulnerability. And this is operated by CISA, which is our United States Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Now, this thing is absolutely great. It's got tons of information. And what it does, kind of like the CVE program, it takes all those CVE vulnerabilities and it structures it in a way under 3 different criteria to help organizations identify and remediate risks. And how it does that is, like I just said, it has 3 criteria. So I'm going to go ahead and explain how that works. So criteria number 1 is the vulnerability is assigned what's called a CVE ID. This is a unique common identifier that gives a vulnerability a name. Number 2 criteria, it has to have active exploitation. So these are vulnerabilities that are actually being exploited, which means attackers could be using malicious coding or software to actually exploit companies using these vulnerabilities. And the third, which is the light at the end of the tunnel, clear remediation guidance. So we're not just saying, oh, you got bad news. It's actually offering some instructions on how to fix these or mitigate or have a workaround for these vulnerabilities. And I just used some terms here, and I just want to briefly go over them because it's extremely important in the vulnerability management process to understand the different terms and how you go about addressing vulnerabilities. So I use the term mitigation, and what these are kind of band-aids. They're very short-term solutions that can prevent or reduce the impact of a vulnerability. And I stress short-term because they're not permanent fixes. And then secondly is a workaround. This could involve a manual change to a configuration of a computer, a software. And again, this is extremely short term. It's not meant to be permanent, and it often can affect business workflow. And a perfect example of a workaround was about a year and a half ago, 2021. Microsoft had a very serious vulnerability, which was nicknamed the print nightmare vulnerability. And essentially, it gave um, regular users access to a computer. They were able to, through the installation of print drivers, gain administrator access. And this allowed attackers to get into systems without an admin account and wreak absolute havoc on companies' networks. And one of the workarounds was to just simply disable the principle of service, which sounded great at first, but if you rely on printing, if you have a laboratory, you need to print barcodes and things, it prevented the computer from printing, which obviously is not a very realistic approach. And finally, just to finish up here with the KEVs, one of the really great things too that can help organizations is subscribing to receive their alerts. These can come every Monday, and depending on severity, they could come every day if there's something going on. And CISA's like, you guys need to address this immediately. Here's an alert. And those will actually have a link to the vendor page, so you can find out exactly what needs to get fixed. Currently, right now on CISA.gov for their KEV catalog, there are 860 active vulnerabilities being exploited right now. Which ones affect you? If you don't have the answer to that question, hopefully after today, you can go and find out those answers. And Heather actually, she found us a great screenshot. This is an actual alert that our security team here at DAS, we receive on Mondays and stuff. And Heather, you want to go ahead and explain this awesome screenshot that you got?
Yeah, so as Nick mentioned, you can subscribe to alerts from CISA.gov and receive emails similar to this one. This one actually came over last night. We can see a new vulnerability was added or it was identified and then added to the KEV. It's a good idea to ensure whoever is managing your IT or security is subscribed to these alerts and actively reviewing them. Let's review the life cycle of vulnerability management. Starts with preparing, gather preliminary information for assets and technology. Discover and determine the frequency of your scan. Analyze the enormous amount of data that is generated through scanning is a key capability of a robust vulnerability management solution. And then you'll have your report stage where data becomes actionable at this point. An efficient vulnerability management solution will generate a variety of reports focusing on threat analysis, service level agreement status, regulatory compliance, and expiration dates. Then you'll move into remediation. Depending on the asset and the vulnerability found, remediation can be done quickly and remotely, or it may require a more complex hands-on fix that may require taking some systems offline, using redundant systems, and implementing additional controls. Nick, will you break down the steps in the vulnerability management lifecycle for us?
Absolutely. Thank you for going over that. So most like a lot of things in cybersecurity, step one always starts with prepare. And in this case, that starts with having a strategy to formulate a plan on how you're going to address or create this vulnerability management process. And so step one is prepare. And the main goal of when you're developing a strategy is you want to take the organization's critical success factors and business requirements and align those with a vulnerability management process. Everything should be in sync, having nice continuity, and that way that's going to allow for infrastructure flaws to be addressed very efficiently. So, and how you create the strategy is definitely a team effort. It's not usually on one person's shoulders. You want to engage everybody who has decision-making authority because it's going to involve a lot of different departments. So everybody should be involved one way or another. And once the strategy has been clearly defined, it's going to have some guidelines laid out, such as, how are we going to perform vulnerability assessments? How deep do we want to dig into our systems? Things like that. And also, how are we going to resource the solution? It's not just about buying fancy tools. You have to account for labor and personnel involvement and devices used, things like that as well. So that should all be outlined in the strategy. And at that point, once you have that strategy nice and agreed upon, then you can actually transition that into a documented plan. And the plan is actually it's going to kick off some of the action. And you can call it almost like an action plan. And this is going to have rules and guidelines for everybody involved to follow. It's going to have teams and individuals defined with their roles and what they're supposed to do. It's going to help them understand the expectations of these individuals and teams, and also how are they going to be able to use the resources, things like that. So after you have the strategy and then that you got to formulate the plan, now we get to go to some of the fun stuff. And this is step 2, discover. This is where you actually take the plan and you implement it. And the best way to discover vulnerabilities in an organization break down to 2 methods. You have vulnerability scanning and vulnerability assessment. Now, you might have seen these terms before, and if you're unsure about what they mean, don't worry. We're going to go into that right now with the differences between a vulnerability scan and a vulnerability assessment. And I would just like to point out, it's very important to understand the language here, because if you're doing any type of cybersecurity insurance questionnaire or HIPAA questionnaire, they might ask, are you doing a vulnerability assessment? And if you don't know the difference, you might be putting the wrong answer. So it's very important to understand the difference between the scan and assessment, because they are completely 2 different things. And one is a lot more involved than the other. So let's go ahead and break down what the differences are. So when we're talking in the general to a vulnerability scan, this generally refers to the automated tools to identify IT assets, attributes, and associated vulnerabilities. It often runs in the background. So actually employees on their computer probably won't even know their system's being scanned. They might notice their computer might run a little slower, but it doesn't really interfere with the user at all. Vulnerability scans can run internally and also externally as well, which is great. So you're going to get that inside view behind their firewall to identify any vulnerabilities inside the network. But the external scan, that's going to kind of be almost from like an attacker's perspective. You're going to get to see what they would see on your external IP address, whether you have some servers exposed or your firewall is not secured, things like that. It's going to give you some great information. So moving down now to go over what a vulnerability assessment is. So this often it gets referred to as a penetration test. So we like to call vulnerability assessments because sometimes penetration tests, there's different forms. We don't want to get it too complicated because not all of those apply to a lot of companies. But essentially, vulnerability assessment goes a lot deeper than a scan. It's much more comprehensive. There's a lot more actions and things involved. And you don't normally apply a penetration test to an entire organization. You'd kind of get the vulnerabilities found from a scan, and then you would tailor the test to specific instances, hosts, or vulnerabilities that were discovered. And I just wanted to add a side note here. Penetration tests can also be physical security. They're not always just on the remote or the cyber side, but that depends on organization needs or their requirements. So either you did a scan or assessment. Hopefully you did a vulnerability assessment so that you're getting the full scope and information out of your network. You really get that nice story to be told, and you know absolutely what's going on. Now it's time to analyze the data. So these vulnerability assessments, they kick out tons of information and data, and it's very important to really take the time to analyze them. And 2 things that really come out of the analyzing stage is, one, you're going to see all the vulnerabilities that you found, and then you're going to get to analyze possible root causes for why they're there in the first place. And the root causes part is extremely important because you might be able to see a common theme of why certain vulnerabilities are popping up, and these can also create new ones in the future. Maybe it's something with a audit policy, or maybe there's not a password policy implemented, And so maybe you fix it now, but if it's not properly addressed, it could just keep popping up with new users or new employees. So this is a great time to really dig down deep and look over on what exactly is going on. And also, you get more to the vulnerability impact of it as well. So when you're going over these, you're not just looking at how bad it is or what system was infected. Now it's time to think of, okay, how does it affect my organization? And we broke it down into four main factors. And I'll start off with the financial. So the financial can have two parts. One, it's how much does it cost if we don't fix it? You know, what kind of financial impact if our system goes down and, you know, the business shuts down for 3 days, how much money we would lose, how much money would have to get paid out to clients or vendors or such like that. How much it would cost to have to replace computers and stuff because we decided not to fix the vulnerability. And also the second time is, you know, what if it was that vulnerability opened the door for ransomware? What kind of financial responsibility are we going to be expected, you know, to take a ransomware attack? So that's definitely a very important factor. I think all four of these are quite important. So I'll move on to the next one, which is reputation. In today's world with social media, its reputation can be anything. It could be the life or death of an organization. So data breaches are never fun, but you have to analyze these vulnerabilities and the impacts. Like, okay, if we choose not to fix this or it gets exploited, what kind of reputation hit would our organization take? Can we recover from this? You know, and reputation can also lead to a financial loss as well. And the third one is probably the most important, I would hope, for most people, and that's the safety of people. If you have you think about you have a vulnerability found where you don't really have a guest check-in system. You're not keeping track of who's coming in and out of your building. You know, that's a vulnerability. And what safety risk or concern is that proposing to your employees or to your customers or clients? And also, a lot of things are digital. Heather mentioned earlier with the healthcare industry, you know, a lot of things are automated, like fire suppression, your HVAC, heating and cooling systems. And if there's a vulnerability there that's not being addressed, what's the safety concern if there was a fire or some sort of event and people weren't being alerted because that system went down? And then the fourth and final is the legal. Again, kind of like financial, it has two parts to it. You know, what are the legal obligations to actually fixing these vulnerabilities? And then the second would be, what's the legal repercussions if we chose not to? Things like that. Or, you know, hopefully this wouldn't happen, but if we did have a data breach and patient info got leaked, you know, what's the legal repercussions that those patients are going to have against us? So those are four factors when you're really analyzing the impact of a vulnerability. You want to make sure those are included in that process so that you can clearly define the best way to go about it. And this is going to help lead right into step 4. Step 4 is, again, it's going to have a lot of information, but this is where that organization starts to get, the information starts to get very organized. And this is with our report. And some reports, depending on who provided the assessment, can be worded slightly different, but they should have about 6 elements to them. And I'll start with the executive summary. This is going to have, should include a date and range of the assessment, the purpose of the assessment, the general status and summary of findings regarding the risk to the organization. Next, it would include your scan results. This should have an explanation of those scan results, and it'll also have how they were categorized and ordered the vulnerabilities that were found. And it'll also kind of overview like a table of contents of all the other reports that were created and provided. Next is methodology, just how it sounds. It's how was it performed, tools and tests that were used for the vulnerability scanning and penetration testing. Each tool might, if there was multiple tools and tests performed, you would want a specific purpose of why that certain tool was used and what did it accomplish. And you also would want the environment that the tool was used in. Next would be findings. These would be the systems that were identified, that were scanned, and also the ones that could not get scanned or tested against, whether, you know, if the computer was shut down at the time of the assessment. Obviously, not going to get a whole lot of information on of it, if any. So that would be kind of detailed in the report as well of why it was not, or if it was. And then going down to number 5 would be your risk assessment. This is going to be a very important report. And this is going to have all your vulnerabilities identified and indexed, and they'll be categorized based on their severity. So it'll start at critical, high, medium, or low, and it'll give an explanation of why that particular vulnerability was labeled as at the severity it was. Maybe it's something from CISA just said, hey, this is a crazy vulnerability. That could get rated as a critical. And we'll keep that in mind too, because that's very important for the final step. Number 6 is recommendations. So again, light at the end of the tunnel here. It's not all bad. You'll get a list of actions of what the organization can take to fix these vulnerabilities. And also not just the fixes, but also what other security tools that could be purchased or deployed to help remove some of these other vulnerabilities or prevent new ones from happening as well. And overall, just increase the security posture for the organization. Also, not everything's about the devices. It could be policies. Maybe we recommend certain security policies being written and implemented to help educate users on how these devices and systems are intended to be used. Or they could be configuration recommends. We looked at your firewall. We saw that it had some legacy protocols enabled. We recommend shutting those off for safety. Things like that is just a quick example. And now that we have the report, now we get to finally move on to the final step 5. And as Heather explained in the key objectives and stuff and the life cycle, prioritize and remediate is step number 5. And you're going to use the report to prioritize these vulnerabilities. And that was during the risk assessment I mentioned. We'll keep the categories in mind because the severity of the vulnerability is really going to dictate how things get prioritized. However, some organizations, it's going to be very tailored. So they might have different paths going forward. Maybe there's a critical vulnerability in a system that's getting replaced, next month. So maybe that's not something that would get addressed immediately. But in general, that's how you'll prioritize these vulnerabilities, is based on their severity. Obviously, you don't want to waste time and resources on something that has a very low impact on your organization. You'd want to focus energy on something that's critical. And once that's done, now you can finally start fixing stuff or develop a plan to fix these vulnerabilities. And another thing about the priorities too, when you're planning on how to fix things, is like I mentioned before with the CISA alerts, these can offer a lot of insight as well and kind of help you make those decisions. When I was in college for cybersecurity, actually one of my friends, he got hired and they had an incident, unfortunately, where we actually got a CISA alert about a firewall vendor with a severe vulnerability. Because we got that alert here at DAS, we were able to jump right into it, see if we were affected, and if we were able to remediate immediately. His company, however, they didn't really have any vulnerability management in place, and they were having some network issues, and they actually logged into their firewall to see what was going on, and they discovered they had these unknown users that had admin access to their firewall, and they thought it was weird, and they were kind of, emailing around the IT department, hey, did you create this user? Hey, did you create this user? Well, if they actually had CISA alerts and they would have been linked right to the firewall vendor's documentation of that vulnerability, right there in big black ink, it actually will tell you if you see these users, they are malicious and it's part of the vulnerability that was announced. And then it offered steps how to fix that. And unfortunately, because they weren't on top of that, that got missed, and that could have led to pretty much a network takeover. So that's just another reason to point out why this process is so important and to be taken very seriously, because small things can turn into massive headaches later down the road. So just continuing here with the final step. After you've determined what needs to get fixed, what can you fix, or you have a plan to fix, now you need to talk about what you're not going to fix. And this is what's called risk acceptance. And this is something that should be taken under very consideration. And also, it's keep in mind risk acceptance is not something that's permanent. There should be clear details defining one, why it's being accepted, and also have a expiration date or a deadline on the acceptance so that you can come back and reevaluate that risk acceptance. A common example of this is maybe you have X-ray software that only runs on Windows 7. Well, Windows 7 is an extremely vulnerable system. It's not shouldn't be used at all or connected to a network. But maybe next month the software vendor's going, hey, we actually have an updated version coming out for Windows 10. So this would be something you could accept as risk or have a workaround or a mitigation. And then you would have a deadline. Okay, next month we're going to reevaluate this so we can upgrade these systems and remove this vulnerability. So risk acceptance should never be permanent. It always should be something that has an expiration date. You don't want stuff just laying around that you just, oh, we'll just deal with it or just forget about it and it'll go away. That's definitely not the case. And we hope nobody would do that and expose themselves to that threat. So after you get all these 5 steps completed, you actually have a bonus step, and this is rinse and repeat. Vulnerability management is not a one and done. It's something that needs to go to be constant. And that's really how the only way you can be absolutely efficient and on top of these vulnerabilities is having constant vulnerability assessments performed. And in fact, CISA actually recommends that you do have some type of constant vulnerability scanning going on in your environment to constantly keep up with new vulnerabilities found. And one of the biggest reasons for this too is the threat landscape changes rapidly. There's always stuff new going on. Technology is always advancing. Just in the last 4 to 5 years alone, just how far computers and smartphones have come along, just the capabilities that they're capable of have really made outdated systems like extremely vulnerable, more so than it would have 10 years ago. So that's very important to stay on top of it. And I know a lot of companies, they do, oh, we do annual assessments. Well, that's great. I'm glad to hear that you're doing at least once a year. However, that's not sufficient. And a perfect example of why, because if you do one, say in September, and then you wait all the way till next September to do another one, that's a lot of time in between those when things can change or happen and things can go left unfound and your organization vulnerable. For instance, maybe an IT member or somebody opened up a configuration change and that caused a port in the firewall to be left open to the public. Well, if you weren't doing any type of constant scanning, that would be 12 months or whatever to the next assessment before it was found. I mean, that's a long time to go with something exposed to the public like that. And that's why they're just not sufficient. And I just wanted to go over some couple new changes that all of our organizations go under. New employees, you have to think, if you don't have proper security awareness training, a new employee is a big vulnerability. They may not be unfamiliar with how to use the computer properly or what they're supposed to do, or they're opening up emails they shouldn't open up. So that's another reason why constant vulnerability management ongoing process is so important, because it'll catch these flaws when they arise. Also, you always have new IT equipment coming into the infrastructure. What are you doing to make sure they were set up properly? What are you doing to make sure they're being tracked and managed properly? Again, a vulnerability management process that's constant would always keep adding these to the list here. And also software vendors, they change too, and that's out of your control. And sometimes maybe they pushed an update that was not a good one and you didn't know about it. So having this vulnerability management process would actually detect that. And then you can go to their IT support and like, hey, this is scanned. Can you tell me, what we need to do to get this fixed? So that's important too, because you don't want to just assume that a third-party vendor, software vendor, is doing what they're supposed to be doing as well. You got to protect yourself, your organization first. And so we've done a lot of talking, and I apologize, there's a lot of slides, but Heather actually has this great workflow chart that's just kind of go back through the process real quick and just kind of give you a visual on how the handling vulnerabilities perform. Go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Some great information there. So as Nick mentioned, we wanted to bring this to you today. It's a decision workflow chart for handling a vulnerability. So you can see it starts with identifying the vulnerability, and then you'll ask yourself, is it possible to remediate? If yes, apply the fix and validate. If no, if it's possible to remediate first, yes, and then if no, possible to mitigate. If it's possible to mitigate, you'll apply those mitigation controls. If it's not possible to mitigate, you'll determine or ask yourself if you need to accept the risk. If you can accept the risk, then you'll approve an exception. And if you apply mitigation controls or approve the exception, you'll revisit on expiration. So that's tying into what Nick was saying, is those are temporary, options there in your vulnerability. If you can't accept the risk, then you'll go back to trying to determine if it's possible to remediate. Nick, did you have anything else on that you'd like to add?
No, you did a great job on explaining this little workflow. Uh, Yeah, and I'm glad you pointed out just a reminder, about the expirations, and that's why I had that in the slides, and that's very important to know too. You want to constantly revisit these risks that were accepted, or even mitigated, or have a workaround to make sure that they're completely being remediated at one point, just to once again strengthen your security posture and your infrastructure.
Thank you. Nick, can you tell us about closing vulnerability scan gap?
Absolutely. So these are some questions I have here, just for anyone listening to take away. And if you have vulnerability assessments that have a defined frequency once a year or once a quarter, I'd like to ask, when you don't have an assessment or any type of constant scanning going on, what are you currently doing in your organization to identify and fix vulnerabilities? Um, what do you have to monitor all of your software and computers to make sure they're updated, things like that. And also what type of security controls that you have in place to audit policies or user behavior and stuff like that. Uh, so go on, next one. And the most important thing is because, you're not going to wait a full year to update your computer. Windows will update, every week if it wants to with an awesome reboot when you don't want it to. So that's very important to keep that inventory and tracked, so you actually know, like, hey, this computer hasn't been rebooted in 90 days. Well, you know that if it hasn't been rebooted in 90 days, it's out of date. It hasn't been updated with the most recent security patches. So what are you using to catch that or to automate that process? And going on further with the gaps, when we talk about asset inventory and why it's so important, it's because you can't protect what you don't know. If you have computers or devices connected to your network that you just didn't know about, then you definitely don't know if there's a vulnerability associated with it or not. So these need to be constantly updated, as I just mentioned, and there needs to be a audit process in place to validate that these vulnerabilities, one, are being detected, and also validated that they were truly, in fact, fixed. Sometimes you might fix a vulnerability, but maybe the fix just didn't work. And you wouldn't know that unless you had, again, an ongoing process that would go back and validate that those vulnerabilities are in fact remediated. And Heather, actually here, we wanted just to leave you all with something to take away. And Heather found this great general IT asset inventory template. And Heather, you want to go ahead and describe that?
Sure. So as Nick mentioned earlier, IT asset management is a component in vulnerability management. We put together a few items that you should know about each one of your assets. We recommend that you have this information on file and keep it updated. It's also something that you can use when you're completing your security risk assessment. This isn't super fancy, but we run into a lot of companies that really don't know this information about each of their assets. And we just thought it would be helpful to kind of list up some things that we think would be helpful for you to keep track of.
Yeah, that's great, Heather. Thank you for having that. That'll definitely help any organizations go back and find out whether or not that's being handled or if they do have something already in place. Um, and we just kind of want to just start to close it up here. And, we've been talking a lot about like firewalls, computers, devices, IT assets, but it's important to know that vulnerabilities are not just stuff. It's not just physical devices. There's also the user behavior, your employees, those could be vulnerabilities. Not having SOPs or proper SOPs in place. You don't want a standard procedure just to offer punishments of what happens if you don't follow the guidelines or the rules. They also should be educating your users too, kind of clearly defining and how exactly they're supposed to be using a computer or how they're supposed to be doing their job. That way, you're teaching employees behavior that has security built in with it. Which is very helpful. And that's why things like security awareness training are so important because it's ongoing and that can help solve things like complacency, which can be a huge vulnerability, especially when it comes to email security. So ongoing security awareness training is a huge way to help address and remediate these types of vulnerabilities that are not just involved around computers and printers and things like that. And to finish up here with my little parts, I just wanted to touch, the goal of cybersecurity, because at the end of the day, we spend a lot of talk about tools, but the number one goal of cybersecurity is to protect people. A lot of people don't know that. They think it's all about the cyber, the internet, and things, and it's actually not. It's about people. People are the most important asset to an organization. You can replace a computer. You can, restore a computer. You can buy a new printer. It's very difficult to replace good people, and that's why we take such care and we're so serious about cybersecurity. Because honestly, we just don't want to see anybody get hurt. And things like data breaches, they may not seem like they hurt somebody, but they really do, and they have lifelong effects. In fact, the Department of Justice for the U.S. government, they actually released in 2018 alone, there was over $15 billion lost to identity theft. And as Heather clearly defined right in the beginning, patient data is very valuable. Attackers want to go steal that data. There's a lot of things they can do with it, not just stealing identities. They can try to submit bills to insurance companies using that insurance information. So it's very lucrative for criminals, and that's why we take such care and why we stress these things so importantly. It's because we just don't want to see people get hurt. And Heather, I know you have some great statistics here that you'd like to share with our viewers.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So, I'm always trying to keep my eye on the news. I'm sure you guys are too. And we're seeing, different articles pop up about different data breaches. It can be really intimidating and scary. A takeaway that I saw from a recent article was that 2/3 of patient care organizations have now been victims of ransomware attacks, with 1/3 reporting that they've been hit at least twice by such attacks. So this is where we really see the importance of ongoing vulnerability management, first to try to prevent the breach to begin with, but also to ensure that high level of security is an ongoing effort. We do offer security solutions here at DAS, and I'd like to run through them quickly, simply to make you aware of areas that we can help support your security program. Security audits and assessments are recommended to be conducted on an annual basis. At DAS Health, we run automated tools that search for vulnerabilities, conduct a penetration test to see if an outsider can get into your network, and we've created our own expert manual review that looks at over 60 additional function areas within your network. We provide you with a risk-ranked list of vulnerabilities and help you come up with a mitigation plan. Some really good things have come out of conducting these for clients, and if you don't know the last time you had a technical security audit, it's probably time to schedule it. We offer a solution to complete your annual security risk assessment. Our tool also comes with annual HIPAA training for employees, HIPAA policy and procedure templates, places to upload copies of your vendor BAAs and track security incidents and access. And this is your friendly reminder that it's due before the end of the year. Human error plays a significant role in security, and we do offer a security awareness training tool. It provides education to your employees so that when they are presented with a faux email, they can detect it immediately. How well do you think your employees can detect a scam? Our solution offers annual security training, micro refresher trainings throughout the year, simulated phishing emails, dark web scanning, and security policy and procedure templates. MFA for RDP or VPN access is something we also offer here at DAS. If you have remote staff or hybrid workers, please make sure that you've added MFA to layer your security and prevented the ability for a hacker to get into your network. SOC services is a solution that we offer here at DAS Health. Think about all of the logs of data that come in from all of your various devices and programs. It would take a little bit of time to filter through all of that data to identify a real risk, right? Our SOC services is a 24/7 operation based in the U.S. that contains several veteran cybersecurity experts, and they filter through all of those logs and flag real risks. The quicker you stop the bleeding, the less the damage, right? With our vulnerability management products, you can develop an ongoing capability to detect risks introduced into your environment by new or zero-day vulnerabilities, configuration errors, system changes, hacker footholds, and tools. And we also offer endpoint protection, which alerts and stops ransomware attacks, privilege escalation, malware outbreaks, and various other threats by centrally managing endpoints. Before we end, I do want to let you know that we plan to continue our webinars on cybersecurity here at DAS next year. We've received some awesome feedback and have sincerely enjoyed putting these together for you. Security is our passion, and please feel free to continue to provide feedback and let us know how any additional topics that you'd like us to cover. So keep an eye out for registration emails or follow us on LinkedIn to stay in the loop there too. Thank you for your time today, and I hope that we've provided you with information that you can take back to your teams and continue to strengthen your security defenses. Please let us know if you're interested in having a further conversation about your unique infrastructure and maturing your cybersecurity posture. If you are currently a DAS Health customer, you can connect with your account manager or me directly, and I've listed my contact information on the screen. I'll leave the screen up while we take any questions. Chelsea, have any questions come in?
They have. How did you know?
That's
So
great.
thank you again, Heather and Nick. Really appreciate the information, and thank you everybody who joined us today. I know that was a lot of information at you super fast. So if you missed any of it, again, don't worry. We will be sending out a copy of the slides along with the recording to anybody who registered, and just some general information. We do that with all of our webinars. So if you ever see one that piques your interest, but maybe you don't know if you're going to be able to attend it, go ahead and register for it anyways. That way you'll always be sure to receive the slides and recording, and you can review them at your own time. So with that, we're just going to go through the questions in the order that we've received them. So if you have any questions, now is a great time to ask. Don't hold back. There are no silly questions. We do this to help. We love doing the educational part of this, so please don't hold back. So the first question is vulnerability management required? Heather, do you want to grab that one?
I'll actually hand that off to Nick.
Oh, sorry, Nick, you want to grab that one?
Sure. Yeah, no problem. Is it required? Absolutely. Whether it's through compliance or cybersecurity insurance, we're seeing that a lot. Actually, cybersecurity insurance, they have a lot more strict requirements than some of the other legislation that was passed. But when it comes to managing your infrastructure and finding weaknesses and flaws, yes, it's required, because you don't truly know how great your security is unless you're testing it or validating its effectiveness.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Nick. Wow, you presented a lot of information. How do I get this process even started? Nick, you want to grab that?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, kind of going back to the early steps, is you want to meet with your IT security personnel or maybe your security officer, and you want to sit down and start the discussion of, hey, this is a very important topic. This is something that we need to get on, especially going into 2023 with cyber threats increasing every year after year. So the first step is just starting to get the conversation started so you can start to develop a strategy.
Okay, thanks. Well, that kind of cues it up for the next question, which makes it sound like we planned this, but it's just how it works sometimes. Speaking of 2023, what is the biggest security threat going into 2023?
Yeah, the biggest security threat I would say is not to sound redundant, but not having a great vulnerability management process in place. So there's a lot of new things that are happening right now as far as threats, and we don't always get to see those until they start happening. But if you're applying best practices already, you have a very strong chance of surviving or doing a lot better than the business down the street. So we always recommend, with the security threats going into next year, if you're doing the best practice, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. It shouldn't be too much of a stressful thing that when these news breaks happen. And that's the best advice I could give. If you're doing the best practices, you'll be in a good position.
Okay, perfect. And it looks like this may be our last question. So if you're sitting on any questions, now is a great time to ask them. Don't hold back. And we'll linger on for a couple minutes after Nick answers it, just in case some people are still typing as well. So Nick, let's see, where did it go? How can we tell if a vulnerability management program is effective?
Yeah, so that goes back to when I was talking about having a process to validate that vulnerabilities were um, remediated or truly fixed. And that's a very simple process of if you do an assessment and you have 15 vulnerabilities, um, well, you need to validate whether or not they were fixed. So you would actually just do another one to verify that they were fixed. And if that assessment comes through and it's like, oh, there's only 5 vulnerabilities left, well, I would say that that's an effective solution because you went from 15 vulnerabilities down to 5. And the effectiveness is just something that's going to hold to time. And that's just going to be a process of, like I said, the constant vulnerability scanning. DAS, we actually deploy a security appliance into your infrastructure that runs constant scanning with weekly summaries. And that'll essentially um, test your effectiveness is because eventually you'll get those vulnerabilities down to a very manageable number.
Okay, great. Well, that was again some really great information, and thank you everybody for taking your time out of your busy day to join us today. I hope that you found some informative, useful tidbits to take back to the office with you. And if you think of any questions after the fact, again, you see Heather's information up on the screen. Feel free to reach out to her directly. You can always reply back to the email that I'll be sending with a link to the slides and recording, or as always, your account manager is a great advocate for you as well. Basically, any way that you can get a hold of us, we're happy to help. That's why we're here, so don't hesitate, and we look forward to doing some more webinars soon. We have a government incentives one next week, as well as a remote patient monitoring one next week. So if you'd like any more information on those, also drop us a note. We'll be happy to get you registered for those. And besides that, have a great day, and thanks for joining us.